Lyndon Baines Johnson was our 36th president, but before that, he was a representative. He ran for the Senate in 1940 and lost because of some shenanigans going down in Texas. The votes were stolen as the tallies were coming in. They found votes in other places. I know that hasn't happened since, but it did happen then in 1940. After that, he served in the Navy in World War II, actually reported under Douglas MacArthur, and then came back to the United States, ran for Senate again in 1948, and again, this time used all of those things that they were doing before against him in his favor, so that he actually stole that election and became a senator in, and this is, pretty well documented that he stole the election in 1948 in Texas. He was then in the Senate as one of the senators from Texas, one of the largest states, so very important, and he became not, first of all, the majority whip, and then the minority leader. So, and as a leader in the Senate, was very, very influential and very effective. He's known for being someone who was very, very effective. As a leader in the Senate, he held the reins pretty tightly. He would. There was something called, and you can look it up. You can Google a picture called the Johnson stare or the Johnson treatment, where if he's talking with someone, he just leans in, so he gets real close to them, and uses all of his facial expressions and that intimidation to get kind of what he wanted. Mary McGrory described it as, quote, an incredible potent mixture of persuasion, badgering, flattery, threats, reminders of past favors, and future advantages. He just wielded that power really well. He was then chosen by John F. Kennedy as, even though they had run against each other in the primary, he was then chosen as the vice president. And then, of course, when JFK was assassinated, became the president. And as president, he pressed those in the Congress just as hard as when he was the minority leader. The Harvard Business Review wrote an article, and they said this: for most of his career, Johnson was an archetypal politician, trading favors and flattery in generous measure. He was manipulative and devious, searching out and exploiting the weaknesses of colleagues and rivals alike. Yet once Johnson achieved the power he so ruthlessly sought, he seemed to undergo a sea change, turning into a visionary of breathtaking scope. And I read some articles that said he would just find, someone in the Senate or Congress that was kind of a lonely bachelor and just kind of befriend them. He hated baseball, but he'd take him to baseball games, just doing whatever he can. Anything he could find to get into this person's life, to get them to vote the way they wanted to. His staffers would come and say, well, I think he's going to vote this way. He's like, I don't care what you think. I want to know. He was one of the greatest gatherer of intel in the White House and in the Senate, because he just wanted to know how he could leverage this person or that person. Again, Robert Caro, who was his biographer, said this, quote, for Johnson, all men were tools, and to use them, he had to know their weaknesses. Of course, most people don't voluntarily show their weaknesses, and he had to employ all manner of stratagems to get people to expose them. For instance, he believed that what a man said with his mouth was less relevant than what he said with his eyes, so he taught his staff to read people's eyes. Another of his favorite gambits was to keep a conversation going. He knew that what a person wants to tell you is never as important as what he doesn't want to tell you. And the longer he could keep a conversation with someone going, the better he could see what that person was avoiding. Not surprisingly, Johnson was a great conversationalist. He seldom read books, but he did know how to read people. Now, we look at someone like that, and of course, if you know much more about Lyndon Baines Johnson, you know he was just a horrible person. Forget that he wrecked America with his social programs, that we're still dealing with that, but just as a person, very horrible. And yet, there is something about that leadership quality of influencing others that we, in some measure, admire, right? We want our leaders to be able to get things done and know how to work with people. When it's done well, you have a great, effective diplomat. When it's done poorly, you have a conniving autocrat. Now, sometimes it's called, and this term is maybe one you've heard, but Machiavellian. It's named for Niccolo Machiavelli, who wrote a book called The Prince. And in that book, he says leaders should use whatever they can to achieve the ends. They should be able to do whatever they can so that they can help the state. And whatever power you can use to achieve your goals. An article in Psychology Today said this: Machiavellianism is a personality trait characterized by manipulativeness, deceitfulness, high levels of self-interest, and a tendency to see other people as a means to an end. In sinners, of course, this can be very, very dangerous. Again, from that same article in Psychology Today, Machiavellianism, along with narcissism and psychopathy, make up a collection of unpleasant and closely related personality traits known as the dark triad. Now, there are many such figures like this in the Bible. Think about Jezebel. Oh, you want that vineyard? I can get it for you. Think about Herod the Great and Herod that we read about in the Bible. Think about Jehu, who not only staged a coup, but also was able to eradicate Baal and just kind of maneuver. We look at that and we look at it with awe, but we say there's supposed to be a better way. And one of these characters that we're going to look at today is the character of Absalom. Remember that Amnon, who was the crown prince, Absalom's half-brother, forced Tamar, his half-sister, Absalom's full sister, forced her against her will and then sent her off, dishonored her, and David did nothing. Absalom then lured Amnon away, lured him with the king's sons, killed him, and then ran off into exile. Then we looked at, as Absalom was banished, David wanted him to come back in some way. Joab brought this woman in. So we talked about in bringing back the banished, this idea of her convincing David that she should let him back in. And so he says, you can come. But look at chapter 14, verse 24. The king said, let him turn to his own house and let him not see my face. So Absalom returned to his own house and saw not the king's face. So the idea is this. Okay, all right, he can come back to Israel. He can dwell in the land. He can even go back to his own house, but he's not going to be a part of my administration anymore. You know, it'd be like if Edward Snowden, all right, Edward, we are going to bring you back. We're going to pardon you, but you're not going to work for the government anymore. Seems like maybe a wise thing to do, I guess, depending on how you think Edward Snowden, what he did was right or wrong, but that's kind of the idea. Absalom was, as one of the king's sons, one of the chief rulers, involved in administration. And David says, all right, you can come back, but you can't be involved in the day-to-day of the way the kingdom's running. Chapter 14, verse 28 says, so Absalom dwelt 2 full years in Jerusalem and saw not the king's face. So right there, looking at the palace, maybe even David would come by, but he was not allowed to go and be a part of that. And Absalom was not content with that. He had bigger plans, and so he set them into motion. In Absalom, I've called my message the manipulator. We see this manipulator. Now, how do we identify a manipulator in our own lives? How do we as Christians avoid these tendencies that we find in Absalom? And what do we do if we encounter one of these types of people? I want to give you some characteristics of Absalom that are probably true of some people that you meet, hopefully not true of you. Characteristic number 1 is that they are pragmatic. The ends justify the means is their mantra. Now, we're living in a very pragmatic society where pragmatism is in some ways a virtue. And even some of us, we look at President Trump, and he's very pragmatic. He's gonna do a lot of things that are going to make a lot of people upset, but he's going to try to get things done. And we sometimes admire that sort of thing and say that's the way it should be. Why mess around when you can just get to the end? Now, Absalom wants to ask Joab to help reinstate him. Chapter 14, verse 29, therefore Absalom sent for Joab to have him sent to the king, but he would not come to him. And when he sent again the second time, he would not come. So he says, hey, Joab, I'd like to talk to you about being reinstated. I want to go see the king. And Joab just totally ghosts him. Just, I'm not going to listen. I'm not going to come. Joab already stuck his neck out to get him back, not for Absalom's sake, but for David's sake. And he's not going to do that again. Joab is, what's the word? He is shrewd. And he knows poison when he sees it. He knows that this is not going to go well for him if he allies himself with Absalom. So he says, no way. But Absalom is not going to just quit. Now, David hadn't condemned him, but just let him back in. And this half forgiveness it festers. 2 whole years he's dwelling in Jerusalem. 2 full years, it says, he's dwelling in Jerusalem. And he can see all of what's going on around him. And he's not a part of it, and he has to be a part of it. So he tries to get in with Joab, the only kind of one that he knows. He lives close by to him, and he says, if I can just get to Joab, then I can get in. But Joab's not playing. And so Absalom doesn't give up. He says, well, there are other ways to get Joab's attention. So he says in verse 30, therefore he said to his servant, see, Joab's field is near mine, and he hath barley there. Go set it on fire. And so Absalom's servant set the field on fire. Again, here's Absalom working not on his own, but through his servants. If this thing goes really, really badly, he could be like, well, let me call these servants in and find out what's going on. Why are they setting fires? It must have gotten out of hand. But he's also sending a message that Joab gets. Now, Joab is not one to mess with. So this is a very dangerous thing Absalom's doing. He's poking the bear, which is really interesting the way the story plays out. But he's trying to get what he wants. He's pragmatic. And the ends justify the means. He wants to get in. So Joab comes over. Verse 31, Joab arose and came to Absalom unto his house and said unto him, wherefore have thy servant set my field on fire? What is going on? You have my attention. I just imagine Joab stalking over and being like, okay, what do you want? Now Absalom has his attention. Now, Christians understand that it's not just the end, that the means matter as well, right? We can't use methods like lying and stealing and rumors and insults and complaints as much as we want to. Doesn't it seem like sometimes it's really unfair that other people can use that? They can spread rumors, they can lie about you, they can take things, and we as Christians just aren't allowed to do that. Like, I would love to have some kind of campaign where we just lied to people about what's going on in Planned Parenthood. Now, thankfully, you don't have to. What's going on is horrible enough that if we just told the truth, that would be enough. However, the other side uses lies, and so it's really, and it's on a bigger level, but even just on a personal level. Have you ever been lied against, and you're like, man, I'd love to use that for myself? You know, just kind of start some rumors over here, and we just know as a Christian, yeah, we might get what we want, their confession, their repentance, whatever, but we can't use sin to do it. We as Christians, we say, no, listen, the end matters, but the means matter as well. Paul, when he was talking to the Corinthians, was really careful to talk about not just the end, the gospel being spread, but also the means that he used. He said this in 1 Corinthians 2, verse 4, my speech and my preaching was not with enticing words of man's wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power. Paul knew how to use rhetoric. He knew how to manipulate. He knew how to move and change people. And he said, I'm not going to do that. Because if I come in man's wisdom, you'll have a bunch of false conversions. Yeah, there might be some people that get saved genuinely, but I'd rather do it the right way than the wrong way and have to deal with the outcome there. Why? Why is it that we understand the means matter? One, because we want to honor God with our holiness. You have to use holy means because that honors God working in holiness. But two, we believe that the end is not really the end. Let the world say what the end is. The end of a Christian is what? The glory of God. And that means that I can't use methods that are available to other people. Why? Because my end is to honor God and to glorify Him, to bring Him glory and to please Him in all that I say, do, and think. That is, again, a reminder for us that the end is important, but the means are just as important because God's involved in all of it. So what can we do? What should we do when we meet a rank pragmatist? One, we shouldn't give in when they try to manipulate us. We should stop the cycle. We can teach them a very important word. No, we're not going to do that. Now, Joab doesn't. Joab goes, in verse 33, Joab came to the king and told him, when he called for Absalom, he came to the king. So Joab just gives in, and that teaches Absalom, this works. I wanted something. I went and got it. No one stood in my way. And we as Christians sometimes have to, as hard as it is, stand in someone's way and say, listen, I know that you want this thing, but I wouldn't even mind necessarily giving it to you. But I'm saying no, because I need you to know that the end can't just always be the thing that you're going for, that the means matter as well, the way that you get there. The road is just as important as the destination in what you're doing. And if you're using these other means, sinful means, to get what you want, that's not going to do well for you later in life. Parents, that's our privilege, it's our joy to teach our children that the means matter. The way we get there matters, and not just the end. Right? It's important to teach our children. You want to grow up and you want to have a job, you want to make money. That can be a very good thing. But just understand that money is in itself a means to an end, and the end should always be glorifying God. We should also then remind them of the ultimate means, that glory of God. That's what we ought to do when we meet pragmatists. So that's one characteristic, pragmatism. Number two, he has a victim mentality. So look at verse number 32, and I'll just go real quickly here. Verse 32, Absalom answered Joab. So Joab says, why did you set my field on fire? And listen to what Absalom says. He doesn't say, I'm sorry, but he says, behold, I sent unto thee, saying, come hither, that I may send thee to the king to say, wherefore am I come from Geshur? Why did I come back? Right? What's the point of coming back if I can't even be a part of the administration anymore? It had been good for me to have been there still. Now, therefore, let me see the king's face. And if there be an iniquity in me, let him kill me. Right? So he feels like he's being treated really, really unfairly. And he wants something different. I don't like the way things are. I don't feel like I deserve this. I'm being mistreated. Notice he says, if there be any iniquity in me. Sorry, if? You killed your brother. Like, I understand what he did was wrong. But you killed your brother. If there be any iniquity in me, what are you talking about? He's trying to get a different position. There's no acknowledgement of sin. And again, I understand some people use confession as a means to an end. You're trying to manipulate. But here, there's not even that. He's just saying, this isn't fair. You ask me to come back, and then you don't even reinstate me? I don't want to just live here in my own house in Jerusalem. Come on, do something with me. You either kill me or put me back where I belong. Now, here's the thing. If David wanted Absalom dead, he would have been dead. Hey, Joab, go over there and kill him. That's going to happen later with other people. If this person's doing this thing, go take care of him. Absalom knows David's not going to kill me. My father loves me too much. He's not going to do that. So he puts it on the line and says, listen, I'm being treated really unfairly. Restore me or kill me. Those are the only two options. Now, those aren't the only two options, but here's Absalom whining that he's a victim. Have you noticed that our society has really come to value victimhood? We've really come to say that if you're a victim, that you have these higher qualities. Sometimes it's called, and the more groups that you're kind of in that are part of this victim class, the more points you have. It's called intersectionality. So if you're this and this and this, if the race is something where you're a victim, and also you're a part of this other minority group, and also this is kind of your background, you could really build a picture of, listen, I really deserve to be treated in a different way because I have become a victim. Even lawyer ads, right? They're playing on this. Are you a victim of a car crash? Are you suffering because of this? Now, that may well be true, but they're trying to play off this idea of victimhood mentality. Bradley Campbell and Jason Manning wrote a book called The Rise of Victimhood Culture from 2014. And they talk about microaggressions, which is people that, something happens to you that's not really that big of a deal, but you take it personally. You're so thin-skinned that every little thing that someone might do or say, you take personally. And the idea isn't just to be upset. It's to say that I'm a victim. I'm being oppressed. I'm being abused. I am a victim. Psychologists identify this as what they call a need for drama, or NFD. And Carlin Flora, in her article on Psychology Today, says this: it has three components: interpersonal manipulation, which is a tendency to control or mess with other people; impulsive outspokenness, a habit of speaking out at inappropriate times, and persistent perceived victimhood, a propensity for believing one is a victim in situations that others would dismiss as benign. You ever had someone complain to you, this happened, and this happened, and you're like, that's not a big deal. Like, that happens to people all the time. It happens to me like 5 times in a week, and I don't even think about it until just now. But there are people that they just thrive in this idea of being a victim. Christians will not embrace such a position. Listen, it may be that you are in fact, you are a victim. You've been wronged, you've been mistreated, that people have not done what you deserve in life. And for that, let me say, I'm sorry that it's happened. I really am. I don't want to make light of that at all. And yet, God calls us to not embrace that, not make that our identity, that we have been victims of our circumstances. Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 11 through 14, even unto this present hour we both hunger and thirst and are naked and are buffeted and have no certain dwelling place and labor, working with our own hands, being reviled, we bless, being persecuted, we suffer it, being defamed, we entreat. We are made as the filth of the world and as the offscouring of all things unto this day. And then he says, I write not these things to shame you, but as my beloved sons, I warn you. Right? He's not saying, he's like, I acknowledge that we've been mistreated. He'll later say, I've been shipwrecked, I've been beaten with rods, they've stoned me. And he's like, and all this I do for the glory of God. He says in another place in Romans chapter 8, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? As it is written, for thy sake we are killed all the day long. We are accounted as sheep for the slaughter. Now what a perfect setup for a victimhood mentality. What's the next verse? Nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. Paul wasn't going to sit in his victimness and the fact that he'd been abused. When we embrace that victimhood mentality, we are admitting that we are a product of our circumstances instead of being in the plans of a loving heavenly Father. And the irony is that the claim of victimhood, that we are out of control, is an attempt to try to get control back. And what God calls us to do is to give up that desire for control to him. Is it easy? No. Is it fair? Not all the time. But it's what God calls us to do. So what can or should be done with someone who is trying to worm their way into something that you have because they're claiming victimhood? One, acknowledge what you can and contextualize the suffering where you cannot. All right, if someone has really suffered, it's okay to say, I'm really sorry that that's happened. I'm really, I can't imagine what I would do if I were in your situation. I'm sorry that happened. However, God is not God's will for you to stay there in that. And God wants to deliver you. Encourage them the grace to endure. It's important to ask, okay, what needs to happen for you to feel closure? And if they say, I'm always going to be a victim, there's never going to be anything that anybody can do, then you're dealing with a really hurt person, but probably someone that's been lied to about holding on to this victimhood mentality as well. It's a good question just to ask, okay, what needs to happen before we can move on from what's happened? And when you tell people to move on, you're not callously waving away what they've suffered. You're just saying, listen, God just does not want you here all the time. It would have been really smart for Joab to say, listen, I don't think that's going to happen. You did wrong. Amnon did too, but you did wrong. We can look at some positions, maybe as an envoy in a foreign place, but you're not going to be reinstated again. And that's what I'm going to tell the king. And the king might have said this very same thing. Listen, you're free to go wherever you want, but you're not going to be a part of the administration. And just that's the way it's going to be. Instead, look at verse 33. When he had called for Absalom, he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king. And the king kissed Absalom, and everything's fine. Like nothing changed. Nothing happened. Absalom's getting what he wants. He uses whatever means possible. Characteristic number 3 is a self-focus. In chapter 14, verses 25 through 27, it describes Absalom. We don't always get descriptions of who these characters are. This is really interesting. It's interesting not just that it's here, but where it's here. Verse 25, but in all Israel there was none to be so much praised as Absalom for his beauty. From the sole of his foot, even to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. And when he polled his head, for it was at every year's end that he polled it or shaved it, because the hair was very heavy on him, therefore he polled it, he weighed the hair of his head at 200 shekels after the king's weight, 6 pounds. 6 pounds of hair. Now, you're Seth, you're working on a message and you were just like dive down the rabbit hole of like, how in the world could you have 6 pounds of hair? Like, that's a lot of hair. And I don't know exactly. Some people think maybe that he had, just oiled it really well, so he would kind of smell good. Josephus says that Absalom and his men would put gold sprinkled in their hair to kind of just appear to him. I don't know what the deal was, but the Bible says he had a lot of hair, and it was kind of a glory for him. Verse 27, and unto Absalom there were born 3 sons and 1 daughter whose name was Tamar. She was a woman of a fair countenance. Later on, Absalom's going to say he didn't have any sons, so presumably they died in infancy, especially if we don't have their names. But he named his daughter after his defiled sister, Tamar. Tamar then was a constant reminder of what David hadn't done right. So there's this self-focus. We see that he's physically striking. He polled or shaved his hair, probably publicly, to show that he was the part. And then, like a weirdo, weighed it so that everybody knew how much his hair weighed. Now, studies show that good-looking people get 3 to 4% more salary. They're more likely to get promotion. They do better in service. And there's a lot of different ways, scientifically, psychologically, that goes into that. Part of it, most of it, is just we like dealing with attractive people. We're a lot more likely to give an attractive person what they want. Right? And so that's just the way that the world works. That's the way that our brain works. And, it's a burden, right? It's a burden to be so attractive. Just have everything you want just laid out for you, right? So what does Absalom do with this? Well, he pumps himself up. Look at chapter 15, verse 1. It came to pass after this that Absalom prepared him chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. Where's Absalom? Asked no one. You always knew where he was because you heard a chariot and 50 men running in front of him. I don't think the President of the United States has 50 people running in front of him. He maybe has 50 Secret Service members at any one time, but I'm not even sure of that, right? 50 guys running before him, announcing his coming, and then he shows up in a chariot, right? It's not very subtle. He just wants to show everybody, hey, I'm important. I'm a big deal. You should look at me. You should wonder after me. And by the way, I'm really good looking and I have heavy hair. Sometimes this idea is called narcissism. Now, we're using the word narcissism a lot in our society. For people that aren't narcissists, they're just really, really selfish. But we're also dealing with a culture and society that's becoming so much more selfish that it's kind of creating a culture where people that would normally just be kind of selfish are like hyper selfish, and that's maybe what we're talking about when we talk about narcissism. There's like a 40-point scale that psychologists have come up with for narcissism. Most of us are in the teens, but then you have people that are way, way out there. All right, so Christians are called to think of ourselves and others differently. We are not called to do what Absalom does or to do what most people in the world are, self-promoting. Do what feels good to you. If you have to run over other people to get what you want, then do it. Romans 12, verse 3, Paul says, for I say through the grace given unto me, to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, according as God hath dealt to every man the measure of faith. He said in Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem other better than themselves. Look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. That's the Christian way. That we would not be self-focused, that we would not be coming to church or doing what we're doing so that other people would know us, but as a Christian, we would want to not only promote others, but that if there was any focus on us, it would all redound to the glory of the Lord Jesus Christ. That's a struggle. I understand this because I'm like you. I like to be liked. I like when people say, hey, I appreciate what you're doing, and I appreciate the encouragement. I try not to let it go to my head. I like when I hear from officers and deputies that they appreciate the chaplain's work that I do. But really, again, if I have a whole ministry where I'm a chaplain that helps people, but they don't know Christ, then I've failed. If they, when they see me, see somebody who's ambitious and kind, that's not what I want. I want them to see Jesus Christ. And it's a struggle to not want to be seen in that way because all of us want to be liked. You might even say, I don't care what people think about me. You absolutely do. You absolutely do. And so we as Christians are called to step out of that by God's grace and look upon the needs of others. Why? Because we have Christ as our example. 2 Corinthians 8, verse 9 says, you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, that ye through his poverty might be rich. What can you do with someone who is then self-focused or a self-focused narcissist? The first thing to do is just to hold them accountable, to be able to put some kind of boundary and say, listen, you're not going to do this. I know what you're doing, and this is not the way it's going to be. I love you. I care about you. I want to help you. But what you want, you can't have. And I'm not going to be changed and manipulated. You do your worst. It's offense for their ego. But honestly, to be perfectly honest, it's really, really hard to expect any change in a narcissist. It just statistically, they're not going to change that much at all. So the best thing is just to really put some distance between you and that person. That's not a real easy thing to say, but that's just the case. Characteristic number 4, then, is a flatterer, someone who uses their words to try to manipulate and work in someone's life in a bad way. Absalom is reinstated, and he immediately goes public and goes on the offense. Look at verse 2. Absalom rose up early and stood beside the way of the gate. So where is he? He is at the place where everybody's coming and going into the gates of the city of Jerusalem. I don't know which one, but he was one. Now, the gate was not just where, highly trafficked. It was also a place where commerce was done. It was also a place where judgments were made. Remember Ruth and Boaz? They took off the shoe and where they gathered all the people around there in the gate. So this was a big deal. And Absalom, probably with his chariot and 50 guys, shows up early in the morning and he's there. He wants to be the first one there. And here's a guy coming in. And he says, where are you from? The guy says, I'm from Jericho. And he says, okay, let's talk. I'm the first face you're going to meet. And here's a guy with long, luxurious hair. And I picture him, getting there in the morning and just kind of tossing it, right? And just saying, all right, ready to do business. And people like that. And people see this guy, and he starts to manipulate them. Notice, so let me read the passage, and then I'll just point out a few things. So verse 2, Absalom rose up early and stood beside the way of the gate. And it was so that when any man had a controversy, came to the king for judgment, then Absalom called unto him and said, of what city art thou? And he said, thy servant is one of the tribes of Israel. I think this is talking about not Judah, but Israel. He's trying to really leverage the 11 tribes and kind of not so much with Judah because he doesn't want to get back to his dad what's going on. Verse 3, Absalom said unto him, see, thy matters are good and right, but there is no man deputed of the king to hear thee. Absalom said moreover, oh, that I were made judge in the land, that every man which hath any suit or cause might come unto me, and I would do him justice. And it was so that when any man came nigh to him to do him obeisance, that he put forth his hand and took him and kissed him. And on this matter did Absalom to all Israel that came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Notice a few things here. First of all, he tells them what they want to hear. In verses 2 and 3, he says, your matters are good and right. You've come and you deserve to be heard. The things that you're dealing with, no one should have to deal with that. We'll take care of you. Don't worry, because your matters are important. And then there's a subtle complaint. But it's going to be difficult. The king hasn't deputed or given the authority to anyone So it's going to be a long process. You might have to be here for a while because the king set up this arduous kind of system that you're going to have to go through. But your matters are right and good. I sure wish you could be heard because what you have to say is really important. But the king doesn't have that system set up. The solution, of course, is whenever there's someone like this, the solution is always in themselves. We should do something about this. If I were made judge in the land, I would change the system. I would make sure that someone like you, with important stuff to be said, to be dealt with, that you would get your day in court quickly. I would do you justice if I were the judge in this land. If I were just given the authority, then I would make things right. In verse number 5, people come to him and they put their forehead on the ground. It's the prince. And he's, no, please, no. I couldn't bear you on the ground. No, lifts them up and kisses them. You're a brother. Yeah, let's not speak of me up here and you down there. No, we're both of Israel, and we ought to take care of one another. And this is the way he acted towards everybody. And everybody not only experienced it, but also saw it. And it says, by this, he stole the hearts of the people of Israel. Christians do not use such tactics to get what they need or what they want. The Bible has a lot to say about people who flatter, who lie to other people to get them to hear what they want to hear so that you can get something from them. Proverbs 29, verse 5, a man that flattereth his neighbor spreadeth a net for his feet. You want to trick someone to thinking they're hot stuff when they're not? Flatter them. It'll spread a net for their feet. Psalm 12, verse 3, the Lord shall cut off all flattering lips and the tongue that speaketh proud things. Proverbs 26, 28, a flattering mouth worketh ruin. You're telling someone something that's not true. You're lying to them. Proverbs 20, verse 19, meddle not with him that flattereth with his lips. You can't trust a person like that. 1 Thessalonians 2, verses 5 and 6, Paul says, for neither at any time used we flattering words, as ye know, nor a cloak of covetousness. God is witness, nor of men sought we glory, neither of you, nor yet of others, when we might have been burdensome as the apostles of Christ. We were really careful that we were not trying to flatter anybody. And can I say that up until just a couple of years ago, I really struggled with this, telling people what they wanted to hear, because I knew that it would make them like me. I knew that it would make them think well of me. If I say, hey, you're great, all these things. Now, I do say those things, but I've learned to say those things as an encouragement and not because I want them to like me, not because I'm trying to manipulate them. That's exactly what Absalom doesn't care about people. Absalom cares about one person, maybe two. Cares about him, cares about Tamar and Tamar. He cares about people that are just in his immediate circle, and that's it. And we want, as Christians, to speak truth and to represent reality, not just what they want to hear. Now, that doesn't mean, Christians, that we shouldn't be tactful and polite. You don't have to give the unvarnished truth. You can be kind, even in saying it. However, be aware in your own heart. And again, I was shocked when I realized I'm a flatterer. I'm someone who's trying to manipulate other people with my good words when I don't really think that. And I really had to repent of that. I really had to ask God to change my whole way of thinking about that because I realized this is not the way that Christians are supposed to be. And so that doesn't mean, again, that I think sometimes Christians can be a little brusque, can be a little blunt with people, and we should also be polite, especially in an American society that really values politeness. We ought to be aware of that. So what can we do? What should we do about a flatterer? Not a flat earther, a flatterer. One, don't believe their hype. Have you ever had this where someone comes up to you and they start to, oh yeah, no, and you just know, you don't really think this. You're trying to snow me. What do you want? Just learn to not believe the hype. Now, I've got some really encouraging friends. I have a friend who's a pastor in Osage, and man, he is one of the most encouraging guys ever. And I'll take what he says as an encouragement because I know he's not trying to get anything out of me. So I'm not saying just have this cynical attitude. Yeah, you don't really think that. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying if you know someone's trying to flatter you, just don't believe the hype. Just take it with humility. Also, watch for signs of undue influence in yourself and others. If you know that they're trying to get something, then maybe you can try to head that off and say, listen, I'd love to talk to you about this in a real way. But let's talk about what's really going on rather than all this other stuff that's here. Ask some follow-up questions. Someone should have asked Absalom, listen, do you have the authority to be here? You're saying that you'd like to decide these things, but do you have the authority to do that? What does the king think about what you're doing? Those would have been some pretty important questions to ask. Instead, Absalom is allowed to be there. And as we're going to look at over the next few months, honestly, it goes very badly. Look at chapter 15, verse number 12. At the very, very end, it says, the last little phrase in verse 12 of chapter 15 says, the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. This eventually ends badly, not just for the people of Israel and for David, but also for Absalom. Why? Because a manipulator was allowed to do what he wanted. Let it never be said that Christians are manipulative. Let it never be said that people in our church are trying to get something without just being honest about what we're doing. Let us follow the directives of Christ and the Bible. Let us follow holiness. If there's work to be done, let it be done through the power of the Holy Spirit and not because we are some kind of manipulator.